Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight virtually. My name is Travis S. Becker, and I previously served as the director of the Lionel Cantu Queer Resource Center here at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I am proud to currently be serving as the Assistant Dean of Students, Strategic Initiatives, and Policy Analysis. I will be moderating our conversation tonight. Before we get fully underway, I want to acknowledge that the land where UC Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. Today, the Amamutsun tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of indigenous peoples taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. It's important that we stop and acknowledge that land acknowledgement is important for recognizing the history of stolen land that which we gather, and that the presence of indigenous peoples and their enduring relationship to these traditional homelands is alive and well. It's also important that the land acknowledgement is not just a token gesture, but that we use this as an opportunity to pause and recognize that good work. So the UCSC University Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of our research to the community and to social, economic, environmental, and political issues, proudly featuring the impact of research conducted here at UC Santa Cruz. Tonight, we discuss the explosion of new language and new understandings of gender and sexuality, with LGBTQ+ adolescents often depicted as harbingers of social change in gender and sexuality. So a few housekeeping things before we get started. So before we begin, I would like to share a few details about the event tonight. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function currently. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program, so be on the lookout for that, and you will be prompted. And we also invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Another note is that tonight's event will be recorded, so just as a heads up there. Okay. And now I get the distinct pleasure of getting to welcome and introduce our speakers this evening. So tonight we are joined by Philip Hammack, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Laboratory here at University of California, Santa Cruz. He is an expert on gender and sexual identity diversity and diversity in intimate relationships. His research has been supported by the National Institute of Health and the William T. Grant Foundation and has appeared in numerous scientific journals. He has received several early career awards for his research and has been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. He will provide a historical framework to understand the current landscape and share research on identity labeling amongst adolescents and diverse communities in California. Joining Professor Hammack is Adriana Manago, Associate Professor of Psychology and Head of the Culture and Tech Lab, who will discuss recent research on how queer youth engage with master and alternative narratives for gender and sexuality via social media, and how this process is mediated by affordances of different platforms informed by offline contexts, and how it looks different at various intersections of gender, sexuality, and race and ethnicity. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure again to welcome Professor Hammack.
Thanks so much, Travis. It's really a pleasure to be part of this forum tonight. I actually served in your role earlier on in the pandemic during lockdown, and it's great to see that these events continue to be really well attended, even in spite of the fact that we're no longer in lockdown. So it's great to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides to share. So let me see if I can do this right. Okay, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Let me begin with the stories of two adolescents from my research, both of whom are part of a new generation leading a revolution in how we think about gender and sexual identity. So Danny, a 17-year-old non-binary gay Latinx boy from a community historically unsupportive of gender and sexual diversity in California's Central Valley, narrated his experience of coming to identify as non-binary. He said, when I got to high school, I started learning more about these terms that I didn't really know of, like non-binary, because I knew that I didn't feel all the way like a boy. I did feel like a boy, but I didn't at the same time. When I finally cut my hair when I was around sophomore year, that's when it felt right. That's when it was like, okay, this feels a lot better. Now, Danny's story, like so many of the stories of adolescents in my research, is a story of authenticity. It's a story about the contemporary availability of language to make meaning of their experience of gender and sexuality that aligns with an internal sense of self. Similarly, Sue, a 17-year-old Asian girl from a community historically supportive of gender and sexual diversity in San Francisco Bay Area, narrated her experience of coming to identify with the sexual identity label pansexual. She said, I was about 12 years old, I think. The way I found the label pansexual was the internet, which is really helpful, actually. I spent a lot of time online, messed around with a couple of labels until I found one that I felt fit me because gender wasn't the thing that I cared about. So thanks to new language and the availability of tools such as the internet to discover information about sexual and gender diversity, adolescents like Sue can find the words to fit their inner experience of sexuality at as young an age as 12, a critical moment of development. So Danny, Sue, and other adolescents in this generation, in this birth cohort, Generation Z, are experiencing adolescence in an era of what I call radical authenticity. This is a very specific historical moment. This is a time of alignment between an internal sense of identity and its external presentation. It's a time of new expansive vocabularies to describe our gender and sexual identities within or beyond traditional binaries. It's a time of heightened accessibility of information when it comes to information about gender and sexual diversity. Importantly, it's a time in which prior sources of authority that existed in the 20th century have actually been upended. And this has to do with the internet and social media, which we'll get into, of course. And as a result, it's a time of heightened social creativity and identity expression, new language, new labels coming out all the time. So the young people whose stories I'm focusing on today and who we're talking about were born at the start of the century, recently sort of labeled members of Generation Z. And I want to present just a brief kind of historical timeline of what's happened during, since their birth, to give you a sense of the relationship between their experience and the social context. So throughout their childhood and adolescence, there was heightened attention to issues of cultural diversity, especially with regard to marriage equality, but also some issues that were social justice legacies of the 20th century, such as the repeal of state sodomy laws in 2003 and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that made military service obviously psychologically challenging for LGBT people, to say the least. Also in the, and of course here in California with Proposition 8, I mean, these were young children around the time of Proposition 8 and all the sort of rhetoric around that was happening. And also in the early childhood of this birth cohort, we see the beginnings of transgender visibility, or heightened transgender visibility, I should say, with the first Trans Day of Remembrance, as well as greater visibility for asexuality and the addition of new terminology, including pansexual and polyamory, to the Oxford English Dictionary, signifying a shift in language that was starting to occur during the childhood of this birth cohort. By their middle childhood and early adolescence, there was heightened attention to the problem of bullying LGBT youth after several high-profile suicides around 2010. And around 2011, we start to see greater visibility and discussion around kink with the problematic novel 50 Shades of Grey, but nevertheless, something that brought kink more into mainstream discussions. And then starting around 2013, we start to see a huge uptick in transgender visibility and recognition, just as the marriage equality issue is resolved in 2015. So if you can imagine, you know, someone born right around the turn of this century, and then they're sort of 15 years old as marriage equality is resolved. Now, things are starting, if you're someone who believes in the value of sexual and gender diversity and this sort of expansion of understanding of it, we seem to be on a specific upward trajectory until we get to 2016 and we have what's depicted here as an orange explosion, which I'll represent the election of Donald Trump. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about Trump. He gets way too much attention as it is, and just, we'll leave it at that. But the important thing to note here is the Trump administration actually does not succeed in stopping this momentum, because in fact, it's actually during the Trump years in office that non-binary gender really gets its major recognition during this time. And of course, we all remember there are many moments of setbacks and extraordinary amounts of transphobia in particular during the time of that administration, regression to this transgender military ban, for example, during the Trump years. But there are a series of events that happened in the 21st century that had a huge impact on members of this generation that I have not yet noted. And they've occurred throughout this century, and that is social media. So Facebook starts in 2004, open to the public 2006, Tumblr, Twitter in 2007, Grindr in 2009, Instagram 2010, Snapchat 2011, Tinder 2012, and more recently TikTok. And I cannot, and I know my colleague Adriana is going to go into much more detail on this, but I cannot overstate the significance of this major new way of, as I suggested, the relationship between the individual and sources of authority and information is so radically changed by the emergence of social media and the ability to communicate via that way. So I'll say more about that. And of course, like I said, we'll talk about that quite a bit this evening. I also want to note, relatedly, the Sesta FOSTA legislation that was passed by Congress in 2018. Now, this is an anti-sex trafficking law written in such a way as to hold online platforms accountable for any sex trafficking, which certainly sounds good, sounds like a positive thing on the face of it. But this created legal liabilities that made Craigslist, for example, decide to discontinue its personal ads, and other social media companies such as Tumblr, which is a major refuge for LGBTQ youth, to start censoring and regulating their content related to sexuality. And so over the course of my research, there was a real seismic shift in the number of young people who were relying on Tumblr very significantly for identity expression and development, and then left the platform and turned to other ones that didn't quite replace it, but places like Twitter and TikTok that have some value. And then, of course, most recently, we're living in the midst of a pandemic, the election of a new, more supportive administration in Washington, and just recently, the discovery by Gallup of an official uptick in LGBT identification among members of Generation Z. So with that that provides a kind of, I think, historical backdrop to the various events that have gone on and been significant in the lives of young people today. So with that, I'd like to briefly review what we know about the science of gender and sexual identity development in adolescence. And it may surprise you to know, maybe not, I don't know, that the science lags behind the culture. There's actually a lot we don't know. And here's why. The vast majority of the research on gender and sexual diversity in adolescence does not actually study the labeling process or the process of developing an identity at all. Rather, there's a strong tendency, understandably, to focus on things like bullying and mental health in the aggregate across all adolescents who hold minoritized gender and sexual identities, with nuances looking into their experience, of course. This is really important research, but my claim here is that there is an absence of sufficient focus on diversity of developmental process actually within the broad community of young people who hold minoritized gender or sexual identities. So we social scientists have actually been kind of largely missing a big cultural phenomenon underway. But we do know some things. we know that the taxonomy has broadened considerably when it comes to gender and sexual identity. Language about gender now goes beyond binaries and communicates something about the relationship between assigned sex and gender identity. Language about sexual identity now acknowledges a broader spectrum than the traditional binary labels, gay, lesbian, and straight. Language about sexual identity now says more about the degree of sexual desire and the conditions in which we experience desire rather than just the gendered object of our desire. And finally, language increasingly makes a distinction between sexual and romantic attraction. Now, while we know that these new taxonomies are in use, we actually know little about the nuances, as I've suggested, of the labeling process, or certainly factors associated with the appropriation of particular labels among today's teenagers and young adults. Now, we do know a few things. It does appear that pansexual, the identity label that Sue takes on, is more common among members of Generation Z than bisexual was. I'm a member of Generation X, and bisexual was definitely the more common term, and continues to be a more common term for members of my generation. Now, interestingly, the term, when you interview people about this, the terms do signify similar things: attraction to multiple genders. But those who use pansexual often say that they're trying to signal attraction to trans and non-binary people, or to signal suspicion of the gender binary altogether. So you can kind of see how members of Generation Z might be more likely to use this term, because they've actually grown up in a world in which non-binary thinking and transgender visibility has been significantly higher than members of previous generations, such as my own Generation X or millennials or baby boomers. We also know that labels like queer and pansexual are more common among trans people and cisgender women, which kind of begs a question around whether cisgender male sexuality might continue to be more constrained by binary thinking. And that's something I want to get into, that my research has kind of found some patterns around. So I'll get into that in a moment. We do know that traditional labels like gay and lesbian remain widely used. In contrast to some speculations at the beginning of the century, there is no post-gay or post-lesbian era. These are still terms that young people appropriate and identify with, but increasingly they're challenging the stereotypes associated with them, especially around issues of gender nonconformity, masculinity and femininity, as we understand gender presentation to be a kind of separate phenomenon or separate component to something like sexual identity and gender identity. Now, we do know that gender diversity is on the rise, by which I mean youth are increasingly reporting a gender identity that is distinct from their assigned sex, so non-binary or transgender identity. And one very interesting pattern that appears to be quite consistent, and I discovered in one of my recent research, that those assigned female at birth are more likely to diverge from their assigned sex than those assigned male. Now, a few new discoveries, new dimensions that have come from my research. I'm not going to do a deep dive on my research, because what I was asked to do tonight was to provide a more general kind of historical backdrop, kind of historical overview of what's happening with today's teenagers and young adults. But I do have a recent paper that's referenced here that if you go to my website in the publications, it's just www.philiphammock.com, 2 L's in the Philip. The publication side, it should come up pretty close to the top there. But the new discoveries, kind of new dimensions that my work is drawing on in particular, I'll just mention 3 of them and then present some further narrative data to illustrate. One is around community, by which I mean, well, I'll tell you what I mean in a second, because I've got a slide on it. The other is around intersectionality, and the other is around what I would call gender and power. So let me get into each of those and just kind of give you a quick kind of little snapshot of what I found in some of this research. I was very motivated. I mentioned that, you know, Danny and Sue were from different kinds of communities. Danny's from the Central Valley, Sue's from the San Francisco Bay Area. The nature of my research the past several years has been around looking at how young people living in different types of communities experience gender and sexual diversity, because members of prior generations, such as my own, you know, it was sort of universally awful to be LGBTQ, sort of no matter where you lived. But what we've increasingly seen is that geography matters in the country. And in California, very much is the case as well, and that we do have large parts of the state that are not supportive of gender and sexual diversity, that are more politically conservative, and Central Valley tends to be one of those areas. So I was very interested in, you know, with fewer resources, less visibility, less support for sexual and gender diversity, how do young people fare? Well, one of the things we find is that, and again, this is not too surprising, the teens in high support communities are more likely to identify as non-binary and or queer. And part of the reason why we were very embedded in these communities, we did on the ground ethnographic field work in these communities. And excuse me, one of the real reason is that they're not exposed to the rhetoric as much of some of the non-binary language around gender and sexuality in person or in real life settings. They are online, which Danny identifies as non-binary, discovered much about his sense of non-binary identity online. So there certainly is a context in which they have access, but we do see this general trend, this general pattern, and it's something to think about and be aware of as young people are developing. Communities do matter when it comes to access to the rhetoric, to the vocabulary around this terminology. Now, the intersectionality dimension is incredibly important. Not only does research historically aggregate across all different types of gender and sexual identities within LGBTQ plus communities, it often kind of ends up centering whiteness. There's a very long history of this by not taking seriously questions around race and class and how these other identities and the power related experiences they confer might impact identity development or labeling. So this came up in a few different ways in my research, but I'll mention one very clear example, which has to do with boys of color. And what we found was that boys of color were much less likely to identify with traditional labels or associate in LGBTQ spaces. And JB, a young adult informant that we worked with, has a good kind of take on this. You use a term like gay. It's a term for white people. White people tend to use that term. That's the thinking sometimes. I know that for young men, especially, are not going to identify as gay. Even if they sleep with men, they're not going to identify as gay. And this really is tied to the experience of racism within those settings and a kind of sense of like, that's not me. That's not for me. So this is one example of intersectionality playing a role. Now, the gender and power dimension here, what I want to suggest is that, as I discovered in my research, that teenagers are impacted by the tensions of a shifting gender order. And I think this helps to explain why we're seeing a distinction between those assigned female at birth and those assigned male at birth and their sort of relative participation in this revolutionary moment, I think. So one of the things that I think we're seeing is that those assigned female at birth are actually feeling more empowered as conceptions of femininity have opened up dramatically. Whereas many boys are still feeling incredibly constrained by traditional thinking around masculinity. So just for example, John told us in the study that masculinity, especially at my school, is very important. I feel like a lot of guys, when it comes to if they want a name call or something like that, usually attacks masculinity, attacks their manhood. And there's a wonderful book that I use often in my teaching called Dude, You're a Fag by sociologist CJ Pascoe, in which she conducted on the ground field work in California in a high school in I believe it was early to mid 2000s, and found that the use of the word fag was really to signify a denigration of femininity and gender nonconformity, basically, among boys. And so I was very sad to see that, over a decade later, conducting this research in the schools, that not much had changed in that regard. Not that they necessarily heard this kind of explicit derogatory remark a lot, but you certainly did hear from a lot of boys that they just really felt uncomfortable with the extent to which they may or may not be fitting in. So what we found is that, queer boys, or what we concluded, that queer boys seem to be feeling more insecure as they're increasingly accepted into the world of straight male privilege when they conform to normative masculinity, but critiqued from within queer spaces if they conform too much. So I think this is about shifting conceptions of masculinity, which is in a place of general insecurity and reformulation, which in general I think is a good thing in a society that's been historically patriarchal. It's just creating complications for teen boys, teen queer boys who are kind of caught, if you will, in a number of these. So this is an interesting phenomenon that I wasn't really necessarily expecting to see in the research, but did. And so I'll wrap up so we can turn it over to my colleague, Adriana, just to say a few words about what I think this all means in terms of revolution and paradigm shift and how we think about gender and sexuality. The first thing I'll say is that, I'm really contrasting this century, this era of radical authenticity with the prior century, which I think of as an era of identity. That era, the era of identity, was characterized by categorical and binary thinking and more compulsory narratives about gender and sexuality. And I think it is fading. I do think that is fading, even as young people experience pressures still around it. New language is being created, new narratives are being written, a broader dimension of gender and sexual diversity can now be named. And so this is what I'm calling this era of radical authenticity. Language and embodiment, importantly, this came up in Danny's narrative and with a number of other trans and non-binary youth in my research, that language and embodiment are converging to create new possibilities for authenticity, and that's really important. We can better align the internal, the felt, and the external, the presented self than ever before. We have more language about it, but as I've suggested, the legacies of gender and sexual ideologies continue to constrain these pressures from the past. I mean, historical moments don't change overnight, and gender and sexual ideologies do not change overnight by any means at all. And I'll end with just kind of a somewhat provocative admission that I am trying to move away, actually, from an overemphasis on using the terminology of LGBTQ plus people, since I mean, it's inherently exclusionary. The plus is meant to signify all kinds of labels that are in use, and instead to talk about the phenomenon of sexual and gender diversity. Now, I think this is. I'm moving towards the idea that this is important because I think it's actually more inclusive paradigm of thinking of gender and sexual diversity. By emphasizing the phenomenon rather than the type of person, you start to include a broader range of people into the fold, so to speak. And so I'm increasingly talking about trying to shift the discourse away from this kind of identity-based thinking to a broader diversity paradigm. And I'll just end by saying that you can follow me on Twitter, you can email me, you can download publications from my website, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over back to Travis.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I feel like this is the moment when I really, really miss being in person, because I really, really appreciate your vulnerability and willingness to share. And this is the moment when I feel like we would like to typically pause and like ask for applause or something like that, or for you to get some of that. But here we are virtually. So nonetheless, thank you. And Adriana, I am looking really, really forward to hearing what you have to share. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Go ahead and share my screen. And yeah, Phil provided such a wonderful introduction, sort of the historical background and some good definitions around labeling. And I'm going to dig more into social media as a context for gender development. I'm going to talk about gender and sexual diversity, broadly LGBTQ youth, as well as straight and cisgender adolescents, and thinking about, how social media as a new kind of context for development might be contributing to cultural change and continuity. This work that I'm going to talk about today was supported by a Hellman Foundation Fellowship, as well as the Institute for Social Transformation here at UC Santa Cruz. So I want to begin with the whistleblower. Many of you probably heard about the whistleblower at Facebook. Frances Haugen, she recently revealed documents from inside the company suggesting that Facebook knows the platform is bad for democracy and that Instagram is especially harmful to teen girls' mental health. Haugen's been on 60 Minutes. Her documents informed a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal, such as this one, and she testified in front of Congress, where she was praised by both Democratic and Republican senators. I think one of the reasons that this story has gained so much traction is that it resonates with a common techno-panic narrative that we often see in the US, in which adolescents, especially young white girls, are portrayed as victims of technology. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about Facebook's business model and business practices, but the way we think about social media in adolescence is often through a narrative that is technologically deterministic, overly simplistic, and revitalizes old tropes about gender. A similar theme was in a recent and very popular documentary, The Social Dilemma. The storyline depicted the central adolescent character as an automaton, a marionette at the mercy of social media platforms. These portrayals of adolescents as victims of technology masks the complexity of their experiences. Many adolescents get a lot out of these apps. They're using social media to learn about their social worlds, to connect with others, to construct their identities. And so in my culture and technology lab, we try to capture some of this complexity by taking more of a transactional developmental perspective. So we think about social media not as a determinant of action, but as a cultural tool that adolescents use to relate to others and to construct their identities. So adolescent social media use is embedded in cultural ideologies and narratives that have structured their development, perspectives, and social lives, particularly with respect to gender. Adolescents' gender identities are the products of their engagement with these gender ideologies and narratives, which motivates why and how they use social media in the first place. The outcomes of adolescent social media use depend on their interpretations of their experiences, which influences how they remember and apply those experiences to new situations. And then in the process of application, adolescents are further incorporating or rejecting cultural ideologies and narratives into their gender identities. So it's a cyclical, transactional process rather than a linear, deterministic one. And recently, my students and I explored the upper right arc of this cycle, examining whether gender identity influences how and why adolescents use social media. So in the fall of 2019, right before the pandemic, we surveyed a large sample of local high school adolescents, the vast majority of whom were cisgender. And we asked them about their social media platforms and the purposes of their social media use, what they actually use social media for. To understand their gender identity beyond sex at birth or current identification as female or male, we assess the extent to which they internalized long-standing dominant gender ideologies. So gender ideologies are beliefs, values, and expectations about biological sex and human behavior and relationships that are part of the US macro system. So we asked all adolescents, regardless of their gender identification, about the degree to which they identified with hegemonic masculinity ideology, which are beliefs, values, and expectations for invulnerability and dominance in relationships, and the degree to which they identified with submissive femininity ideology, which are beliefs, values, and expectations for being likable and accommodating in relationships. We also asked participants about the extent to which they endorsed a gender binary ideology, which undergirds masculinity and femininity ideologies and is based on the belief that there are and should be only two genders based on biological sex at birth. So we expected that girls would be using Instagram and Snapchat, and perhaps more likely to identify with femininity ideology, which would then explain their greater likelihood to use social media for emotion bonding and appearance validation compared to boys. These were trends in the data and past research showing gender differences in social media use. We expected boys to be using platforms like Discord or Reddit and more likely to identify with masculinity ideology, which would explain their greater levels of social media use to bond through competitive kinds of activities such as gaming, and also to use social media for bullying. So what we found was something actually a little bit different. In terms of platform use, girls and boys were largely on the same two platforms. Almost all participants named Instagram and Snapchat and their most frequently used social media platforms. However, boys and girls diverged in their third platform preference. Girls are more likely to name TikTok and to a lesser extent Twitter and Tumblr as their third most popular platform. Boys were more likely to name Discord as their third favorite platform and to a lesser extent TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit. TikTok and Discord were just beginning to take off at this time, and they became even more widely used in the following months during the pandemic. So as expected, girls were more likely to use their social media platforms for appearance validation than boys were. However, it was not femininity ideology that was predictive of this form of social media use. Instead, the more girls identified with masculinity ideology, desires for power and invulnerability in relationships, the more they used social media to post photos and compare themselves to peers for appearance validation. In fact, girls and boys did not differ in their identification with masculinity ideology, but boys endorsed the gender binary ideology to a greater extent than girls did. Girls were also more likely to use social media for emotion bonding, but this form of social media use was not related to gender ideologies. So our results suggest that girls' motivations for appearance validation via social media is not about their adherence to traditional notions of submissive femininity to please others, but instead it's a way in which they gain power in their social worlds, something that's not quite captured in the common technopanic narratives that are currently circulating. Research in developmental psychology has shown that starting in early adolescence and even late childhood, girls in the US begin to shift away from being a pink girly girl and begin to align themselves with masculinity in response to their growing understanding of gender social status differences. In later adolescence and emerging adulthood, young women engage in sexual self-objectification, not just to perform for men, but to act like men in their sexual expression. Meanwhile, boys more than girls reported using social media to bond with their friends through competitive activities, which was higher among those who more strongly identified with hegemonic masculinity ideology. Boys were also more likely than girls to report using social media for bullying, and this was a gender effect that was fully explained by boys' greater endorsement of the gender binary. So I interpret this as perhaps as girls embrace masculinity ideology in peer relationships, some boys may become even more committed to enforcing the gender status quo, using social media to perpetrate violence against those who diverge from the gender binary. And this may help to explain why LGBTQ plus adolescents in the US are more than twice as likely as their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts to experience bullying online. So as much as we talk about social media as a liberatory tool for gender and sexual minoritized youth, the reality is social media can also be a source of oppression. For this reason, many LGBTQ plus adolescents have been drawn to alternative social media platforms such as Tumblr. There's been quite a few studies on the benefits of these kinds of platforms for LGBTQ plus youth to explore their identities, find community, information, and belonging. What's so useful about these platforms is that they allow LGBTQ youth to be private in public. And essentially, this is what social media have introduced into our social lives. Social media allows us to scale our social interactions along two separate dimensions, group size and privacy. We can customize the size of the social group we're interacting with, from an intimate dyad to expansive online audiences and everything in between. And we can also customize the richness of social cues we convey and the personal information we reveal about ourselves. So the ability to be private in public, to communicate with varying degrees of anonymity on public platforms such as Tumblr or Twitter is particularly useful for LGBTQ plus youth who are targets of online and offline bullying and who may risk being outed on platforms such as Facebook that do not afford as much control over personal information. So in my lab's interviews with LGBTQ adolescents, we found that youth were acutely aware of their levels of visibility in different social media contexts, and they consciously adjusted the permanence of their communication, the potential audiences, and weighed out the risks and opportunities of online self-expression as they moved seamlessly between multiple different platforms to communicate. The interviews that we conducted with LGBTQ plus adolescents were conducted in person, also before COVID. And essentially we asked participants to give us a tour of their social media platforms. So this is a photo recreation of what the interview looked like. Participants were interviewed as they scrolled through their public posts on their top 3 social media platforms on their mobile devices. Their mobile devices were connected to a computer so that the interviewer could follow along visually with the participant and also record the screen. Logan Varsegian and Sonia Dominguez, my graduate students and undergraduate student, conducted interviews with about 20 local LGBTQ plus adolescents. And each interview was about 2 to 3 hours long and yielded an incredibly rich set of data about adolescents' lives and their meaning making on social media. So the method originates in what we call a go-along approach in ethnographic techniques, where youth provide researchers with a guided tour of their daily lives. In this case, their lives are digital artifacts of significant moments in their identity development. The method foregrounds youth's perspectives and values, asking them to select significant social media posts of the past couple of years of their lives, and then provide context for the interviewer. Data are both audio and visual so that we can analyze what they're actually doing with social media, as well as their interpretations of it. And so going back to our transactional developmental model, this interview study examined the bottom right-hand corner of the cycle. We were interested here in the master and alternative narratives for gender and LGBTQ plus adolescent social media use, as well as their interpretations of their social media use. So gender narratives, like gender ideologies, are part of the macro context, and they're defined as stories or ways of authoring one's life to be a good person or member of a culture. Individuals must engage with master narratives to make sense of who they are, and those whose experiences cannot be understood or understood positively within existing master narrative frameworks must develop alternative narratives to make meaning of their experiences. Over time, some of these alternative narratives may begin to function as new master narratives, both within marginalized communities and the larger culture, and it may become more widespread through social media. So although we did not specifically ask questions about master or alternative narratives in our interviews, they arose organically in our interviews with adolescents. So these were the master and alternative narratives for gender that were referenced in the social media tour interviews. First, traditional gender roles is a master narrative about men and women being inherently different and unequal, with men holding greater power in many domains of life. This narrative was actually the most common across interviews because it's the backdrop against which other narratives are constructed, including the narrative that men and women are equal or that they should be equal. We also found transnormativity narratives in our interviews, and this is an alternative narrative that challenges the master narrative of gender as immutable and based on sex assigned at birth, but it still reinforces the idea of gender as rooted in biology and as stable. Narratives of gender as non-binary, as fluid and transcendent in body type were also present, but to a lesser degree. Adolescents often reference common sexuality narratives as well. They were contending with a sickness narrative that same-sex desire is an illness or a sin. So they weren't necessarily endorsing these narratives, but they referenced them in talking about dealing with family or dealing with bullying and so forth. They also were referencing a species narrative, the notion that same-sex desire is indicative of a certain type of person, and a subject narrative, the notion that same-sex desire is a personally developed and defined aspect of the self. So importantly, the narratives that they were referencing occurred differently across platforms. So I want to give you an example here to illustrate. Consider this one participant from our study. This is a cisgender female who identifies as bisexual and biracial. During the tour of her Instagram, she references the traditional gender narrative when explaining why she posted a bikini photo of herself. She says there is this expectation with social media right now, it's summer, so you're expecting from women bikini pics, but these aren't the things that I usually do, nor are they things that I necessarily put on my Instagram. So although she's distancing herself from the traditional gender narrative to the interviewer, she's not really challenging the narrative online on Instagram on a mainstream platform. So while on Instagram, she refrains from posting anything that challenges dominant gender and sexuality narratives, on Twitter, she uses coded language to speak privately to her LGBTQ plus community in public. So in this quote, she interprets a post in which she makes an inside joke about Brie Larson. She says, "Here's me being like a little gay." She reads her Twitter post. She says, "Brie Larson, all the queer women are all about her right now. These are gay moments you really have to read into. For straight cis people, there's so much that they don't know." So here she's drawing more from maybe a species narrative with sexuality as a way to separate out different types of people in her audience. Although she challenges dominant narratives to some degree, she, as she puts it, she's being just a little gay on Twitter. On the other hand, Tumblr is a place for her to be, as she says, as weird and as expressive as she wants. In this quote, she talks about using the bisexual label on the site, referencing more of a subject narrative and defining her sexuality and being less inhibited in challenging common conceptions of bisexuality. She says, I choose to use the label bisexual because it's so often not used. And this kind of references back to Phil's talk about the bisexual label being less normative and common in Gen Z. She says, people say bi has this inherent definition that you're only attracted to cisgender men and women, which I find doesn't fit for me. So on the one hand, on Instagram, she's contributing to which is sort of reinforcing traditional dominant narratives on this more mainstream platform. But on Tumblr, she's contributing to alternative narratives. She's contesting mainstream or notions about gender and sexuality, about what bisexuality means. And so her experiences on these different platforms are a function of the various affordances on these different platforms. And affordances are not just technological, but they're also cultural. So Instagram has become a place for more mainstream narratives for gender, not just because of the technological functionalities of the tool, but also how youth have socially constructed Instagram as a particular place to be. And so her experiences across different platforms are a function of the different affordances, but it's also a function of her personal proximity to traditional cisgender heterosexual ideals and also whiteness. And so this interplay between individuals' social identities and their visibility was another important pattern that we found in our data. This particular participant is a male, 17 years old, transgender, straight, and white. He was very visible and very public on Instagram. In the interview, he described how he uses the platform to educate cisgender people about the transgender experience and spread awareness of political issues relevant to trans people. He says, I posted this hormone tutorial because I have a lot of people who have questions like, how do you do it? What does it look like? I'm like, I'm just going to post it so I don't have to continually copy and paste. His acknowledgement of the frustration that many transgender people feel regarding questions about their identities and bodies illustrates the difficulty of challenging master narratives. But he goes on to talk about how he tries to use his privilege as a white straight man to be visible for those who cannot be. He says, I try to post a lot of transition photos because a lot of people see before and after photos, which are cool, but it's also cool to see the journey as well. I try to be a spokesperson because I'm okay with questions and I know a lot of people can't be. So documenting his personal journey and knowledge in the process of aligning his body with his gender identity. This adolescent contributes to alternative trans-affirming narratives that at the same time reinforces the role of medical procedures in producing culturally legible transgender bodies. Scholars have discussed how this alternative narrative has become a standard against which claims of transgender experience and identity are held accountable, leaving those who experience gender as non-binary or those who do not desire medical procedures as failing to align both with master narratives of gender and the emerging alternative narrative of transnormativity. And we saw in our interviews that this non-binary narrative was less common, although we have a smaller sample, but it was less common in our interviews. In addition, the differing levels of online outness that this participant is referring to illustrated the many challenges that gender and sexual minority adolescents still face, even as they benefit from the social and political progress of earlier generations. Those who can't be as visible online tend to be farther away from the white, straight male identity. And in this way, there is a systematic loss in the diversity of stories circulated online. Throughout this particular social media tour interview with this adolescent, we saw how much support he had from his family and friends online and offline. And this brings me to the last point I want to make tonight. The ways in which adolescents' visibility, their experiences on social media depends on offline contexts. So this last interview excerpt is from a 19-year-old female transgender pansexual participant, and she's talking about a meme she posted that got a lot of attention on Twitter. The meme included photos of her and her partner kissing in a two-way surveillance mirror at the local pharmacy where they were waiting for hormone prescription. So in order to protect the participant's identity, I'm using this image I found on Google to illustrate the concept of the photo, but it's not the actual photo that she posted. She explains, I'm using the meme format. It's where you're supposed to be able to relate to what the person's saying if it's placed well. I'd spent a long time waiting in line that day and got bored and started taking photos. And at the end, I was like, actually, I really like these photos. They're cute. I might as well share them. So the meme she's referring to is the "What if we kissed" meme that was circulating on Twitter in 2019. It was a way of playing with fantasies of kissing and crushes in unusual locations. So she appropriated the meme, writing, "What if we kissed in the CVS waiting to get hormone replacement therapy?" And this kind of multimedia modality of communication using memes, using visual symbols were really key for youth to navigate gender and sexuality narratives. And this participant is using the meme to normalize LGBTQ+ identities and relationships through her own take on this viral unit of cultural information that was spreading in the Twittersphere. So by posting an intimate moment reflected in a two-way surveillance mirror in a mundane everyday setting, she plays with the joy and the potential risk of being seen together as a queer transgender couple. Her ability to boldly invert a surveillance object into an object for gaining visibility and celebrating transgender identity and love is partly a function of the relatively liberal and progressive community in Santa Cruz, which includes the Diversity Center, a variety of other community supports that many youth in our interview study referenced in their interviews. So this kind of publicness online and offline would be difficult in, say, more rural conservative areas of the country. And our data really did speak to the ways that offline experiences of self-expression or self-silencing were transferred into online modalities. And so to sort of conclude and wrap up today, I hope the research that I discussed begins to illustrate the importance of a transactional developmental approach over a technological deterministic one in understanding youth development and social media. Youth are more than victims of technology. They are agents in their development and they're agents in cultural change. They're capable of higher order cognitive processes. They're able to reflect and respond to their cultural material and their environments and make meaning out of their experiences to construct their identities and contribute to new cultural beliefs, values, and narratives for gender and sexuality. So I think we need to be careful about hitting the panic button to protect adolescents by limiting or censoring their social media use, because we may inadvertently rob them of opportunities for exploration and negotiation in their identity development and in cultural change. I think my research also shows, as Phil also mentioned, that there's an interplay between cultural continuity and change and gender and sexuality, both among straight, heterosexual, cisgender adolescents and the LGBTQ+ community. So the ways in which youth are navigating and contributing to these changes and continuities is influenced by their social positioning, their social identities, intersectionality, their offline context, and the affordances of various social media platforms, which are dynamic and constantly shifting. And so I want to thank all the research participants in my study, my student collaborators, and the Hellman Foundation and the Institute for Social Transformation for funding this work. Graduate student Logan Barsegian was a really important part of this work, as well as Abigail Walsh and undergraduate Sonia Dominguez, Cyrus Howard, and Anna Karen Quinteros. And they all contributed significantly to this research. I couldn't have done it without them. So I look forward to hearing more thoughts and questions and discussion from this fabulous, online talk.
Adriana, thank you so much. And again, I'm finding myself really missing the collective, like the energy and opportunity to really celebrate the brilliance that's being on display here tonight by Professors Hammock and Monago. So thank you so much, Adriana. I really appreciate your contributions. In particular, I'm still stuck on and kind of just heartwarmed by the what if we kissed in CVS anecdote. Like I just think that's such a beautiful way to highlight kind of the culture making that's taking place with queer and trans youth online. Thank you so much for your contributions tonight. All right, folks, so we are going to move into the portion of the evening where we take some questions and answers. So we encourage folks to utilize that feature and to submit your questions, and we'll work. We obviously are not going to have time to get to all of them, and we obviously want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to get as much info as possible. But yeah, feel free to submit your questions and we'll kind of go from here. There's a few that came in from the jump that I want to touch on, if that's okay. And so one of those, let me go ahead and pull up here. The first one, all right. This question came in and person said, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Given your research, what do you suggest what do you suggest we might advocate for at middle and high schools to support sexual and gender diverse students? I thought this was a really kind of good practical one, some sort of theory to practice here. If y'all have any suggestions or ideas, that would be great.
Yeah, I have some ideas specifically with regard to social media. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about social media and let Phil talk about maybe, other labeling and other identity processes. I think that kind of going back to this idea of like technological determinism, I think that we really need to think about empowering adolescents, right? With their ability to reflect, to make meaning. And they are negotiating some really interesting issues online around and cultural changes. And I think like helping them to tap into, what is my purpose with social media? What am I getting? Reflecting on their own behaviors and thinking about what they're getting out of social media. What are the patterns that they're noticing about their own behavior and their friends' behavior? I think it's an incredible tool. And in other words, we see so much projected onto these screens, and it offers such an opportunity for metacognition for young people to reflect on what their goals are and their values are for life, and how they want to use social media to meet those goals and values.
Yeah, and I would just add that, adults need to get on the bus or the train or whatever the right metaphor is, because one of the biggest problems, especially, I didn't talk about mental health tonight, but that was also another key component that is another key component of my research. And this is like the big issue that young people talk about when they talk about resources and lack of resources, is basically sort of lack of cultural competence among adults in their world. And they mean teachers, they mean coaches, they mean principals, they mean their parents. So I mean, adults need to do the work. They can't just look at this and say like, oh wow, that weird new generation, and then try to take away their social media. I mean, this idea of somehow censoring or withholding this incredible context for young people to understand who they are and find like-minded, diverse others. I mean, it's just hugely problematic. And so I think that it really needs to be named. And then, of course, like sex education. Hugely problematic. I mean, like sex education is like way in the dark ages from what I understand. And, it needs to be there. Gender and sexual diversity needs to be on the forefront. Also the history of, I said I wasn't going to talk about LGBTQ people, but the history of LGBTQ people and social movements and everything that's happened. I mean, and it's often not until they get to college that that people learn anything about major historical moments, whether it's, I mean, I know Stonewall's kind of like the easy thing to talk about, but Compton's riot, San Francisco, and the AIDS epidemic, I mean, just like anything in the history is just something you have to seek out. And that's not a good thing. So anyway, education and adults getting on the bus. So that's my answer.
Absolutely.
We'll add one more thing to that as well. This idea, I think we also want, like in some ways, adolescents are the experts, right? They're coming up, they're the pioneers of these new social media technologies. And I think it's really, adolescents are exquisitely attuned to status and power, and they're beginning to have a critical perspective of society. So I think we need to harness those strengths rather than seeing adolescents as weak and impulsive and all of the other terms we use to refer to adolescents. They also have a lot of strengths in their development, and harnessing those strengths and asking them to be the experts and tell us and kind of fully step into that role, I think is another way to think about interacting with adolescents about these issues.
Absolutely, Adriana. The youth will always lead the way, right? And so, for better or worse, it's good to sort of acknowledge that truth and then try to see what we can do to be in partnership with them and move with them, right? I'm interested in the context that we find ourselves in tonight. I keep reminding us, we can't do applause, things like that. A lot of this research, right, and a lot of the data is collected prior to the pandemic. How do you all think COVID has changed youth's experiences with social media, particularly queer and trans youth or LGBTQ plus youth, right? How do you think that, and again, I know that you don't have like formal research to pull off of right now to share this back, but maybe just think out loud with us about what you suspect, suspicions around what you think how COVID may have impacted LGBT youth experiences with social media specifically, and then maybe by extension, identity formation, but yeah.
Yeah, so there is some research now just starting to come out around COVID and social media and adolescents and LGBTQ plus youth. So I did find a little bit of stats on this that I know the Trevor Project is reporting that engagement with their crisis services has doubled over the course of the pandemic. There was another national survey, it was done with college students, in March of 2020, and they found that almost half were reporting having unsupportive family at home, and that about 60% were reporting dealing with anxiety and depression and mental health issues. And so obviously social media becomes a new kind of lifeline in the pandemic if you're dealing with unsupportive family at home. And so it takes on, a new kind of importance, new kinds of salience with both positives and negatives, right? So and depends on what kind of social media we're also talking about. So text-based platforms have become really more prominent because if you're, voice, you might be overheard by parents. So there's sort of different kinds of affordances that become more prominent. There's also some concerns that if we're living our life so much online that a lot of online identity self-presentation, it's like I said, very curated, and there's concerns about social comparison and how like being able to kind of disentangle oneself from that curated presentation focused kind of self. So those are some of the things that are coming up with thinking about COVID, and obviously mental health issues are, becoming more widespread, and social media is also a window into lots of news, lots of misinformation about what's happening as well. So there's a lot going on.
I will say that I think that one thing that I think COVID has did, and one way of thinking about it, particularly the really severe lockdown period, whatnot, was kind of afford the opportunity for a little bit of a hard reset on one's identity or life story. Now, most teenagers are just beginning to write that story, right? So for those who were really in high school, for example, it may not have constituted as much of the hard reset, but I'm thinking of 20 somethings, maybe folks who were like emerging adulthood sort of era. And I think for them, I wouldn't be surprised if in hindsight, this ends up having been a sort of turning point in their life story where they sort of say, oh, I was doing this before. Wait, there's these things that I potentially missed out on. So maybe more coming out, more work on gender affirmation, or coming out with a particular label, or realizing, my identity is what it is, or is more fluid than I thought, those sorts of things. And I would think that the time spent online was a useful resource for thinking about the self during that period. But again, I've seen teeny little hints in research, but nothing really comprehensive. But this is my kind of speculation as a sort of narrative psychologist.
Absolutely. I appreciate those responses, both of those so much. And my anecdotal experiences throughout the pandemic as well are really affirm kind of what you both shared. Phil, I can't tell you how many young folks I knew took their first try at drag during the pandemic.
Right.
Both the trans and cis youth alike who had been wanting to experiment with this idea of gender performance that really used that opportunity during the pandemic to do that. And absolutely. And Adriana, I can't tell you, one of the discussions I was having prior to my role here as assistant dean with the LGBT directors across the system was we were seeing an uptick in college students who were reaching out to our offices saying, hey, I'm kind of having to go back into the closet now that I'm at home. Like, what do you suggest in terms of like, can you send me some headphones so I can come to your programs, things like that. So just want to affirm both of what you just shared. Definitely saw some of that as well. So we're getting some really, really fantastic questions. And so one of them that I wanted to pull up right now, so one of them, Professor, you made mention of men or youth of color not identifying with the word gay because of its various connotations. And then this person shared, I've noticed similarities in queer men and boys in South Africa. Professor Hammack's statement really piqued this person's curiosity, right? And wanting to know, like, has any of your research gone beyond California into southern states of the US or even the global South? And while that could be like a certain like yes or no, anything else you can share around that, Phil?
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, yeah, the short answer is not my personal research, but I think there has been some good work on this, and kind of affirms this issue around the language and the extent to which, especially once we think across cultures, when is gay, for example, considered like, and especially in formerly colonized nations, is this a concept that is coming from the colonizer, for example? And so I think we really get importantly into those issues And there is some good research out there that myself have not conducted, but shows similar issues and the real struggle around those with same-sex attraction who might find the paradigm, kind of that in fact is a colonial sort of paradigm resonating with them. But again, kind of like to Adriana's point about cultural continuity and change, I mean, across cultures that have been colonized, you have the same issue, right? Where the colonial legacy is sort of always a part there too. And so you're always sort of navigating these different discourses. And from my perspective, the most important thing is just to recognize and honor that sexual and gender diversity is a phenomenon that is universal, that it transcends time, it transcends place, and different cultures have had different ways of accommodating, recognizing, denigrating, et cetera. And the right thing to do from my perspective is to allow it to be, to allow it to exist, and that's the right thing ethically and morally.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Phil. Really, really appreciate that. On that kind of similar topic, related to, I think, what you shared about queer men in particular, sort of two questions. The next two questions I'm gonna share are somewhat LinkedIn related, but kind of not quite. Any suggestions on what we can do to help our adolescent boys feel more secure or able to question the gender binary system? Any ideas or suggestions around this?
Yeah, I think that is such a hard one. And I think, as I talked about in my research, it's not just compelling to boys, but I think it's also compelling to young women. It's a source of power, right? And I think it speaks to sort of the broader culture, and what we value competition, we value, capitalism as a macro context. It's so deeply embedded in our culture as a whole, and what we see as valuable, what we see as being a good person, what we see as successful. And so I think unless we address some deep values around, what is considered weak and, vulnerability, and, raising issues around mental health, like it just seeps into so many different aspects of the way that we talk about human behavior and the way we socialize children and so forth. So I think, in terms of thinking about boys and socialization, I mean, I think unless we look at ourselves and look at our gun culture, there's so many different aspects, the military industrial complex. I mean, there's so many different, it's so rooted in so many facets of our culture, that I think we need to, it's going to take a long time. Because it's almost like we're being contradictory, right? We're asking boys to do something that's different from what we as adults in our institutions and our society is doing. So oftentimes we have this thing where like, don't do what I do what I say. Yes. And that just does not work with socialization and child rearing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think that's kind of what I meant when I said, I feel like queer boys are kind of trapped or caught, if you will, in what's happening in the larger culture with regard to gender and power. And they sort of can't figure out what to do about masculinity. It's like they, and I think that I hope over time we'll be able to really disentangle, kind of toxic, what's clearly toxic, right, about masculinity with like queer forms of masculinity that boys can connect with and feel comfortable with. But right now I just see them, and part of it, Adriana, it's just about power. It's about, they're in a place where they're kind of like I alluded to, they're being sort of accepted into kind of straight cis male culture more potentially, and then they can be gay and be open as long as they're conforming to traditional masculinity. That's what the boys talked about in our study, and they said that's why we don't want to go hang out in the queer spaces, because then those boys are going to give us shit. So sorry, I swore, but anyway. Speaking off the cuff, but anyway, so I think just the larger point is that I think we're really in the midst of a process of kind of re-envisioning what masculinity is, what healthy masculinity constitutes, and I'm optimistic. I remain optimistic, but it's tough.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I just want to share too, I think on that note, with regards to the socialization of masculine boys and men, I don't know how many folks are paying attention on pop culture to what Lil Nas X is doing right now, but I am super intrigued to see what could happen, right, in 10 years if we see 5 more artists, queer men like Lil Nas X, queer men of color, really, really messing with ideas of masculinity. So I would love to have this conversation in 10 years and see what's come of that piece. So that's really fantastic. Thank you both.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a little bit about that too. Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
social media is that platform to be creative, and that's the currency of social media. Constantly innovating on memes and having a new take on things, and so perhaps helping boys to see that value of like not being the status quo, but doing something different. And I think social media is a really essential part of that creativity value that youth are jumping into. Yeah.
Thank you both. I appreciate it. So sort of on a little bit of the flip side of that, what can either of you say, or what do you want to say about that may account for the larger number of AFAB or assumed female at birth or associated female at birth folks that are identifying as gender diverse?
So sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. So you mean why that might be happening more? Is that the question?
Yeah. I think you
Okay.
talked a little bit about this, Phil, too. You
Yeah.
sort of speculating around like the possibility of like ties to feminist movement, things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. So I think it actually ties as well to Adriana's point about like that connection between masculinity ideology. I think part of what's happening is that those, assigned or assumed female at birth are in a particular context where like entering into masculinity, if you will, is like more possible than maybe ever before, just because the way in which gender is opened up, like femininity is opened up. But also, yeah, I interpret it more of like I think there would be more folks assigned or assumed male at birth who would enter into it if we didn't have this other issue around masculinity. I mean, that's kind of my feeling about it.
Yep.
I don't know if Adriana has other perspectives.
I mean, my first thought about it is that there's a lot of civic engagement that's happening online. I think we underestimate. We see online media activism as just slacktivism and perhaps not leading to offline action. And I think that we're underestimating the power of online activism actually. And I think just youth like really jumping, tapping into social justice movements, and I think gender and sexual diversity is part of that, and sort of embracing it and considering it something that they might not have considered in the past. And I think youth are identifying in different ways to be part of that social movement, to be part of that way of thinking about gender and sexuality that isn't rooted in the gender binary, recognizing that it doesn't have to be that way. And there are other ways that we could identify. I don't know, that's another thought that I'm having around how I think youth are really motivated around social justice issues, and they're doing it through their own identity development. They're recognizing like the personal is political, and that part of contributing to cultural change is enacting it in their own identities.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Really, really appreciating the discussion. Let me see here. I want to pull up one more, or a few more actually. How were you both touched on this a little bit, but if you want to share a little bit more, how were your participants affected by the changes Tumblr made to the platform a few years ago? I know Dr. Hammock, you sort of touched on sort of the impacts of Fossa Sesta and how that kind of domino effect on Tumblr impacted things. And then I know, Adriana, you talked a little bit more about what you heard from youth or what they were hearing about Tumblr. So what was sort of that impact and banning NSFW on content online on that site?
Yeah, it's funny. I know that Phil talked about a lot of youth, fled or left Tumblr, but actually the youth in our study actually stayed on. Tumblr was such a valuable resource for them. A few of them had their own content got flagged erroneously. So they were certainly not happy with the changes and felt targeted and felt like they were being thrown under the bus in many ways. But also it was like, they loved Tumblr, and that was a place where they found their community. That was a place where they could be expressive, and so many still stayed on, at least within our sample. And so yeah, because our interviews were in like 2019, so just about a year after those changes had happened.
Yeah, and I should just say that since social media was not the focus of the study I was talking about, that I don't really have anything systematic to say about it, except that people talked about leaving, because of this, and sort of just feeling overly censored and feeling like, feeling like it was going to go decline.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas like that wasn't the way they talked about it before Sesta Pasta, where it was like amazing and the best thing ever. So anyway.
Yeah. Oh, totally too. Anecdotally, Phil, we were hearing a lot about that at the time at the Cantu Queer Center. What the heck? I'm off Tumblr. So that makes sense. And it's fascinating for me having those sort of anecdotes than Adriana to sort of hear what the research is showing, right? It's like maybe they stuck around a little bit more. It's just like kind of having to navigate the barriers when getting flagged.
Navigate the barrier. Yeah. And feeling alienated, feeling like, not supported when they were such an important part of that community. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you both. In the several times throughout the talk, we sort of talked about this dominant narrative. I think that was the phrase. And we had a part. Is this ringing any bells to folks? Okay, great. We had a participant ask if you could sort of expand a little bit on that, or share a little bit more about that dominant narrative piece.
Yeah. So the master narrative. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, when I think about master narratives or, dominant ideologies, these are the sort of assumptions we might not even think about, right? They're so deeply embedded. And as I was describing earlier, like in every facet of our culture and our institutions and our beliefs and values and expectations. And so they're so deeply embedded and so widespread and pervasive that that's what makes them dominant. Like traditional gender roles, or just the idea, the gender binary for many of us, many of us in the audience perhaps don't even think about that as some kind of ideology or social construct. We think it's natural and inevitable. So often these master dominant ideologies seem natural and inevitable. They're the cultural waters in which we swim that we don't even know we're swimming in them. And so again, I think I mentioned in the talk that we have to contend with them. So even if we're challenging them, we still have to reference them. And that's sort of something that we saw in our interviews with the LGBTQ plus youth, is that even though, that one excerpt from the Instagram, she wasn't endorsing the traditional gender narrative, but she was still running up against it. She still had to contend with it. She still had to explain herself, or the transgender participant who had to, explain there's this justification for your identity if it doesn't fit into that dominant narrative. So people who do fit into that dominant narrative don't have to really think about their identity. They don't have to explain themselves. If you're following along what everybody expects, you don't have to explain yourself, and you might not be aware of the narrative. It just seems like inevitable and natural way things are.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate that. I've got one question that's a little bit more directed towards Dr. Hammack. So give me one quick second. I want to pull that up. So Dr. Hammack, this person said they're intrigued by your interpretation of authenticity. How are you defining it, and why do you conclude that the diversification of gender and sexual identities indicates greater authenticity?
Well, that's a great question.
I know. I was like, okay.
First of all, yes, I'm actually really glad. By the way, I have a dog in my house who might bark, just FYI to the audience. He just woke up. So but anyway, yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm a narrative psychologist, by which what that means is that I think about the way in which people construct stories, and that provides meaning and coherence to their identities, and that's psychologically beneficial and valuable. So I think of authenticity as a narrative. Authenticity is a story that we're telling ourselves, that we're saying to ourselves, I am living a life that feels true to me. So the way I think about authenticity is not that actually there's some universal essential truth about persons that's like stable. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't believe in fluidity, which I definitely believe in with regard to gender and sexuality. So I think really what it means is, and actually it's I tried to make that contrast actually between identity. This is actually similar to Adriana's point about the species narrative, right? The species narrative of sexuality is this kind of classic identity narrative that like, oh, you are straight, you are gay, you are bi, and that's what this means, or maybe even like the transnormativity narrative to an extent, that there's some kind of implied, inherent, underlying truth. And that's not what the authenticity narrative is. So I'm really glad that the question was asked. The authenticity narrative just means that you are constructing your story and you're able to construct it in a way in which the inner and the outer are consistent. And there's an increased context, I would argue, for people to be able to construct those kinds of life story narratives now because of the culture, because of the historical context in which we live, in which they're better able to match those things, the inner and the outer. So what a great question. I'm glad that was asked, actually.
Me too. I thought it was really, really fantastic and really
Yeah.
appreciated. So wanted to move it forward.
Yeah, because
So,
it's like a philosophical issue. So I like
oh,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah, I like that stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Adriana, you've been doing research on adolescence and social media since MySpace, right? Oh my gosh, I remember my top 8. I remember Tom. I remember all of MySpace. I'm in the Gen X millennial cusp generation that like we had it going into college. So what are major cultural continuities and changes you have observed in gender and social media use since that time?
Yeah, I think the biggest change is we're now thinking about social media as polymedia. And so as I described in my studies, I no longer ask about one social media platform. I ask about, your top 3, or what are the platforms they use most frequently. The social media tour, they gave us a tour of their top 3 social media platforms. And so in the past, MySpace was, where it all was. And there was one public space, and you had to deal with what those affordances were, what that culture was. And now youth are, move seamlessly between different platforms and different kinds of affordances. And I think that idea of like scalable sociality is really powerful, actually. I think adolescents have even more agency to construct their narratives, to, tailor their tailor their social lives in smaller groups or bigger groups, and with different kinds of visual cues or different kinds of levels of anonymity. And so I think they have a lot more agency in being able to tailor their social environments. And I think there's maybe back to that like authenticity question, is like, well, if you're one way on Instagram and you're another way on Twitter, is this creating some kind of incoherency? And we're not seeing that, actually. We're actually seeing that these different platforms, different concepts sort of feed into each other. Just like all of us, we have, different experiences in different contexts. We're different, sort of somewhat different, maybe in the classroom, as we might be different with our best friend than we different with our parents or something. And all of those experiences feed into this narrative, this story that we are authoring about ourselves, and youth are doing that work of creating that coherency. I think the example of she had 3 different quotes on Instagram and Twitter and Tumblr. I think, her experiences on Tumblr, for example, were informing the way she was thinking about the traditional gender narrative on Instagram. So they're all connected. They're all informing each other and creating a really, a lot of diverse kinds of experiences that they can draw from, and figuring out who they are and what feels authentic to them.
Yeah, and I love that you're focused on agency and authorship. I mean, it's so refreshing, and I really haven't heard it. Like, I mean, you and I have talked about it obviously since this stuff came out, but it's really frustrating how sort of quiet that is, and it's really kind of disempowering young people, and frankly, all of us. We are all agents. We are all authors. So.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And I so appreciate, I appreciate your response so much. And I'm really reflecting on the different ways that their social media presences sort of build on and intersect with each other. So I'm appreciating that about what you shared. I'm being mindful of time. We have about 6 more minutes left before we wrap up the evening. So just noting that, of course, so many of you asked brilliant questions this evening, and we'll likely only have time to reach a few more. So just want to sort of name that piece as we kind of navigate moving forward. Another kind of practical sort of theory to practice question that's coming up in the chat, I kind of want to link, or let me just focus on sort of theory to practice question, or sort of some insights. Pull up a question that somebody had with regards to sort of that piece around sort of when teens are at home and they're online, and kind of finding that balance between honoring their privacy, but also trying to be a good parent and do all the stuff in terms of monitoring what's going on online. So let me pull up what the exact question was here. 1 second. All right. I'm scrolling. Where did it go? Okay, I am gonna try the chat now. Okay, so thoughts about the need for adolescent private space online. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Need for adolescent private space online versus parents knowing what they're up to online, especially during COVID. I think contextually when everyone was, talked about that kind of period of the sort of extreme lockdown when everyone was kind of in the house, and sort of honoring parents who may want to honor that privacy, but also find that balance. Do you all have any recommendations you want to think out loud about in terms of that kind of theory to practice piece?
Yeah. In the social media developmental psychology world, we talk about active mediation versus restrictive parental mediation. So the restrictive parental mediation is, you're not allowed to use technology, and I'm going to restrict who you talk to and what sites that you're on, and so forth. Whereas active mediation is shown to be a more effective way of parenting around social media. So active mediation is talking about their experiences, building that kind of trust that adolescents feel like they can, if you respect their autonomy, if you respect their growing needs for autonomy and independence and figuring out things on their own, they'll be more likely to come to you and talk with you and share with you about some of their experiences. When there is that kind of restriction, when parents, I know it's hard, but when parents kind of hit that panic button, what are they doing? They're making it more likely that the next time that adolescent isn't going to come to them to talk about, maybe whenever it might be experience of bullying or whatever it might be. And so active mediation, sharing media together. One of the things that I really loved was that was happening on TikTok during the pandemic is we started to see a lot of families posting videos together. And if you remember that, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, there's a lot of like intergenerational collaboration on TikTok that we noted. And I think that is a perfect example of how parents can see, their adolescent is the expert on TikTok. Let them be the expert. Let them step into that role. And think about more ways in which you can share and talk about social media rather than being that kind of authoritarian, restricting kind of mediation.
Really appreciate.
You want to just throw out there just acknowledgement to all the parents out there for having to sort of, it's a lot. I mean, it's just a lot to learn, right? Because, and it's hard to sometimes be as proficient or literate, with the platforms, with young people are sort of in the driver's seat, like we've been talking about. So I just want to acknowledge, and I'm really like huge kudos to the parents that are doing that work that Adriana is talking about. It's a lot. It's worth it though, I think.
Absolutely. So again, I am mindful of time. I don't think that we have time to ask any more thoughtful questions because I don't want to end up, going too far over or anything like that. So I will begin to wrap us up here. But again, I will say it again, I really wish we could just like applause or something or do anything like that. But just want to really, really again, thank Adriana and Phil for your expertise, for your passions, and for the ways that you've dedicated your lives and your research to this, and the way that you so openly and vulnerably share them here with us. It is meaningful. Events like this can be transformative. It appears to me that there are parents here that are really doing their best to try to support their queer and trans youth. And so I, again, just want to extend my huge thanks to both of you for being here this evening and for sharing with us. This has been really, really incredible. By extension, I want to thank all of our guests here that joined us virtually. I want to thank everybody for asking thoughtful questions, inquisitive questions. Apologies up front that we couldn't get through all of your brilliance with the limited amount of time that we have, but we encourage folks to continue the discussion after this evening. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And we want to remind everyone to please join on November 9th for the next University Forum, which will be on precarity and belonging. So with all of that being said, thanks again, everyone, and have a very good evening. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Travis. Thank you to Phil and everyone. It's wonderful.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.